Hello and welcome to another episode of my podcast. Today we have a special guest, Cory Clark. She's working at the University of Pennsylvania on a very interesting project called the Adversarial Collaboration Project. Welcome to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so why don't we start with you explaining to us what this project is all about?
Yeah, so the Adversarial Collaboration Project is essentially a research initiative where we are trying to get scholars who disagree with one another and who have published contradictory papers or papers that contradict one another, get them to work together and resolve their empirical disagreement. So it's very different from traditional science where if one scholar contradicts another scholar's papers, they both just kind of stay the course of their research project or their research agenda and just publish papers that contradict each other for their whole entire careers, never merge perspectives at all. And we're hoping to essentially just change that norm and make it so that when
Mm.
scholars disagree, they immediately get together and say, like, hey, we're both experts on this topic. Why are we disagreeing? Let's figure this out. And then work together and hopefully forward a more unified perspective into the literature so we don't just have all of these competing claims making things really confusing and hard to understand.
Right now, I've worked in consciousness research, and
Mm.
there it's clear that it's much harder to test theories, which makes it perhaps more likely that people just stick to their guns. It's harder to test, it's harder to interpret evidence in favoring one position over another. And I think there's actually a project going on at UPenn, but I might be wrong, where IET, integrated information theory of consciousness, is being tested against global workspace theory, where some researchers got together to agree on some tests.
There is a huge adversarial collaboration project on consciousness happening, but not at Penn. Where is it? The professor's name is Lucia Maloney.
Hmm.
Lucia? I'm not sure. But it's in Germany, but I forget where in Germany it is.
Interesting, yeah.
So that there is an adversarial collaboration project happening, but I'm not affiliated with it. However, they are also, I think, similarly trying to advocate for adversarial collaboration in general as, a more efficient way of um,
Hmm.
resolving empirical disagreements.
Yeah, how did the project come to be? Was there
Um,
long?
yeah, I think I just met Phil Tetlock at a conference in like January of 2020, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and we chatted there. We were both interested in political bias in science, but we've also, I think, both been interested in like scientific conflict and disagreement.
Hmm.
Um, and so we got to talking there. And then I think when COVID hit, I left my job at Durham University in the United Kingdom and I was looking for what am I going to do now? And I don't know how we came to the idea, but that's when we came to the idea to apply for grant funding to start the adversarial collaboration project at UPenn. And then eventually it came through
Hmm.
and I've been doing that ever since.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, I guess there isn't much of that, even though scientists and philosophers of science have often pointed out that scientists perhaps should work more collaboratively there, where yeah, there's a sense in which sometimes evidence perhaps isn't as clear, and then people try to evaluate that more in favor of their own theory. We're prone to that as humans. We have our biases, right?
Yep.
And that could be a nice way of alleviating that. Did you have some progress in getting researchers together to test competing theories?
Yeah, so the one thing, I mean, related to your point is it seems to me most scientists agree that scholars should be doing adversarial collaborations, but nobody
Hmm,
wants to do them. Well, not
right.
nobody. But people aren't eager to initiate them themselves because they are more work. And I think people are a little
Hmm.
bit afraid of interpersonal conflict. But we have been very successful. We have several ongoing through the adversarial collaboration project in general. Then we've re-granted funds to other adversarial collaboration research teams. And I could be wrong, but I really do think I'm seeing more and more people outside
Hmm.
of my immediate orbit that like have been participating in adversarial collaborations because either I initiated them or they came to me and I,
Oh, that's
helped
wonderful.
facilitate them. I really think it's possible that they are increasing. So we'll
Hmm.
see. I
How
mean, I would
much?
like them to be super normal. Like
Yeah.
everyone does them at least some of the time, but
Hmm.
maybe that's unrealistic. I'm
So how
not
much
sure.
of the problem do you think is that it's harder to get funding for those sorts of projects?
I don't think it's harder to get funding. I actually think it might be, I'm not, so this is just based on my intuition.
Yeah.
I suspect it actually would be easier to get funding,
Hmm.
because funders really like the idea of so scientists want to publish an interesting paper, right? And their identities get tied to some particular theory, and then they feel like they have to defend that idea. Whereas a lot of funders are interested in solving problems. And the best way to solve problems is to know it's actually true. And so scientists probably make kind of bad partners for a lot of funders because scientists have an agenda and funders are trying to solve practical problems.
Hmm.
And so I think probably adversarial collaborations asking for funding for a particular problem with an adversarial collaboration would be more likely to be successful. That said, there are other disincentives. So they take more time, and scholars want to publish as many papers as possible, as
Hmm.
quickly as possible. There is the risk of interpersonal conflict, like maybe you guys can't agree and then you start fighting and that's awkward and uncomfortable and nobody wants to do that. Although it is telling if that happens. Um, uh, I think people are defensive of their research agenda, so they're defensive of the theories that got them their job, that got them their book deal, that made them famous, that they did a TED talk about. People are defensive of that, so that's a barrier. Um, those are probably the biggest barriers. But I had one more, but now I'm forgetting it. So we'll just stick with those three.
Hmm.
Um, but I've become more convinced. Oh, well, I guess the other one is coming on the part of the journals is I don't see, at least so far, a lot of journals are asking scholars to submit adversarial collaborations, but they don't seem to have like the flexibility or the tolerance for the kinds of findings you're going to get
Yeah.
with adversarial collaborations. So like they want 100% supportive, crystal clear, no ambiguity support for this perspective.
Hmm.
And that's not what an adversarial collaboration is going to look like most of the time. It's going to be a small effect here, moderated by this thing here, and it's kind of consistent with both sides, and here's why. And that's not what journals want. Journals want like flashy, like big, like really
Hmm.
broadly important claims.
Right.
That is, I think, a huge mistake because that's how you get a lot of fake information out into the
Yeah, I guess
world.
that's a worry with the top science journals like Science and Nature that they actually tend to go for the titles that are very flashy, but then
Mhm.
tend to overstate the results perhaps quite a bit there.
Yeah, they make it seem like the claims are way bigger and broader and more important than they really are. And that's just not the nature of, I think, like scientific conclusions are going to tend to be like messy and tentative and narrow.
Hmm.
So I blame the journals a little bit for that.
Oh, that's a fair point. Suppose part of the interest is to keep the status as the big journals where your papers have huge impact, get downloaded a lot, appear in all kinds of science communication outlets, and the like. Yeah, I mean, both science and nature also have this aspect where sometimes about articles they publish these smaller pieces that are sort of trying to explain research results more for the general public. And they often
Mhm.
get cited hundreds of times. Uh, but he's a worry that we have this bias in science. So yeah, this episode is going to be about bias in science. And in a way, would it be fair to say that your research has been focused on that?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of generally interested in it is definitely in bias in science, but it's sort of like the various ways that human psychology can interfere with the pursuit of truth.
Hmm.
But I am specifically interested in scientists, because those are the people that I know. Like, I'm sure it'd be really interesting to study journalists too.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I'm interested in the various ways that human psychology can kind of steer scientists and
Hmm.
science in general away from truth. Um, and the adversarial collaboration is kind of just a reaction to that. Like, well, let's
Hmm.
handle this one problem, that one problem being everyone's motivated to defend their own research agenda. But
Right.
there are a lot of biases in science, including like political biases, but also I think just like pan-human tendencies that, we want like socially desirable explanations for things, for
Hmm.
example. And that probably interferes with the pursuit of truth too. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very interested in your research on the connection between the political attitudes of people and then their belief in free will. That seemed very interesting for me now as a philosopher, of course. Um, you wrote that people that tend to be more on the right have a stronger belief in free will, and perhaps it makes sense. There's more of an idea of, well, if someone perhaps has worse life outcomes, they're more to blame for them themselves. Harsher punishments, perhaps in the prison system, versus people who are more left-leaning are often more keen to attribute these perhaps events, your actions, behaviors, more to the social environments, perhaps poverty and the like, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, it seems like bias there also plays a role.
Yeah, potentially. So it's hard to know what exactly is happening. Like, are conservatives more motivated to believe in free will, or liberals more motivated to deny it? I these days I almost feel like free will it's just one of many related concepts that humans kind of use to attribute responsibility. And I
Hmm.
think that's really what it's about. Conservatives are more likely to think individuals are personally responsible for their own behavior and their own outcomes in life. They have the, like, everyone can pull themselves up by the bootstraps kind of attitude. And like, if you're not doing well, like, look at yourself. Whereas liberals are more likely to blame society and like other just general societal problems for people not flourishing.
Hmm.
And so there is a question there of, is it that conservatives are like motivated to believe that, I mean, responsibility is hard because it's barely an empirical assessment. It's more like a moral assessment. But you can look at, for example, attributions of different outcomes to genetic causes. So that's
Hmm.
something there actually could be a truth of the matter too. How much is this caused by genes or environment? Although where free will comes in there, I have no idea. But yeah, we looked at how moral judgments corresponded to free will judgments, and we see that whichever group, so even though conservatives report stronger belief in free will, and they generally tend to think people are more responsible for
Hmm.
their bad outcomes, and they generally blame people more, we find that if you look at things where liberals want to punish more, then they are the ones who attribute more responsibility and are more likely to view those outcomes as a result of the individual's free will. So we
Hmm.
make the claim that, and a lot of research is consistent with this idea. I'm certainly not the first person to say this. This has been going on for many decades. That responsibility judgments are sometimes motivated by a desire to punish people and hold them responsible for
Hmm.
specifically their bad behavior.
Well, that's interesting because among conservatives, it also seems more common to attribute some of your actions to your genes rather than the environment. And so that seems like a special case there.
So I'm not sure about that. There are particular
Hmm.
cases like so people have looked at, for example, homosexuality, and their liberals are more likely to say it's caused by
Hmm.
genes than conservatives. And presumably it's because, whereas conservatives are trying to say, no, you're responsible for being gay, like you can change that if you wanted
Hmm.
to. And liberals are like, no, people are not responsible and they can't change it. It's a fundamental
Yeah.
part of who they are. So I think if you were to look at genes, like how much how much do genes influence human behavior in general? I don't know what you would see with political ideology. I think it would vary according to what we're talking about. So I don't know. And then also, conservatism is associated with religiosity, so that complicates things too, because they would attribute some things to, the way God made you or something.
Right.
So yeah, so I think that I don't know. I think that's complicated.
Hmm.
I couldn't say whether one group or the other is going to
At least if you
attribute
think about something like Nazis, they'd probably attribute quite a lot to genes in your success,
things.
right?
Who, conservatives or liberals?
Uh, National Socialists, Nazis?
Oh, no, I'm saying who would attribute that to genes?
Oh, um, we'll say in sports, they might say, oh, there's something superior about the genes in whites or something along those lines, right? Um, and that at least seem to have overcome. But then we might think about examples in sports more generally, and I'm not sure how that tracks modern political affiliations, where yeah, I'm not sure who would attribute more, say, to the work an athlete puts in versus their genetics, because let's face it, the people at the top level of their sports have great genetics for those sports. It's not just that they put in hard work.
But they also all probably did put in a lot of hard work too.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would be both there, of course. But then there's also like the genetic contribution to working hard. So
Hmm.
um yeah, I don't know when it comes to sports. Maybe you're familiar with data, but I don't know of any data showing whether liberals or conservatives are more likely to attribute athletic talent to genes versus hard work.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Yeah.
had Eric Helms, who's an exercise scientist, recently on to record an episode. And there's this interesting phenomenon where sometimes gym culture is associated with being right-wing.
Mm,
Because you see people going to gyms apparently at least tending to vote more right-wing. And
mm,
that's been explained in various ways, one of which is, well, typically people who go frequently to the gym, they see how they can change their own body, they
mm.
can make changes in their life by putting in effort, and that gives more of a sense of do-it-yourself attitude. Perhaps less you need help from the state or something along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would imagine it would vary though by like type of gym activity. So there,
Hmm.
Mitch Brown, a friend of mine, he's done research on conservatism and masculinity, and there are apparently stereotypes of um, more masculine men are they're viewed as more conservative,
Hmm.
and potentially more masculine men higher in testosterone potentially are more conservative, although I'm not sure how big
Yeah.
that effect would be. Um, but yeah, you could imagine that there even would be differences by like presumably yoga, like
Hmm.
that's probably more liberals than conservatives, whereas like maybe just like straight up weightlifting could potentially be more conservative,
Hmm.
but I'm not sure. Yeah.
I mean, in the past, gyms were much more perhaps targeted to men, whereas nowadays that has changed quite a bit. I'm not sure if I go to the gym now, there seem to be almost as many women lifting
Mm.
weights than men. And that's quite a big change that the gym culture has undergone in the last decades.
Yeah, it seems there are a lot of like female influencers who are like weightlifters.
Yeah,
Got to build that booty somehow.
that's right. Don't have no idea if they'd be more politically right-wing, say,
No, I
than
don't know
left-wing.
either. I
Yeah.
don't have a strong sense yet.
Well, let's move to an interesting study you've recently published called Pro-Social Motives Underlie Scientific Censorship by Scientists, a Perspective and Research Agenda in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And let's see, there's quite a few authors, I think 35?
I think there were 38. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a lot.
So how did that paper come to be?
Um, So originally it was me, Bill Von Hippel and Lee Jessam, who had become interested in scientific censorship. And the three of us had just kind of started working on a general review of scientific censorship, well, both
Hmm.
covering the history of scientific censorship and some of the ways people misunderstand the history of scientific censorship, and then also can we come up with a set of current causes. And then I don't know at what point we decided we should have a bunch of co-authors, but maybe that was Lee's idea. And so we started bringing various other people on. We worked on the paper for quite a while, I think probably for at least a few years. And really the idea kind of just emerged from us conducting the research. Like we didn't
Hmm.
start the paper thinking we were going to conclude that it's mostly pro-social. That was more looking back at sort of famous cases of scientific censorship. Like even you look at Galileo and everybody attributes his censorship to the Catholic Church. But it turns out he was pissing off his colleagues well before the church got involved, because his colleagues
Hmm.
were Aristotelian professors who were threatened by like his
Right.
research. And so it was really the professors who kind of turned Galileo into this like target um, for the Catholic Church. And so we were like, oh, well, there we can see it's actually the professors who are getting irritated. And then you look at, for example, Kinsey research, which annoyed a lot of people on human sexuality. And there too, it was a lot of peers that were concerned about the research, and they would say things
Hmm.
like it's having a corrupting influence on the youth. Um, and so when you look at scientists censoring other scientists, which tends to be what happens because scientists are hanging out with other scientists and scientists are paying attention to other scientists' work, um, they tend to be concerned about like potentially harmful consequences stemming from the information itself. So
Hmm.
this is separate from ethics concerns regarding how data are collected. It's about concerns about the like moral implications of scientific findings. So it really was just going through the history of scientific censorship and then reviewing all of the relevant research on scientific censorship that led us to the conclusion that actually, it really is, it tends to be scientists censoring each other. And it tends to be because they're concerned about potential harmful consequences of spreading this dangerous information.
Hmm.
So it was really natural. It happened kind of naturally, I suppose.
So, looking at the history, then, do you think there has been a change in the history of science, where there has been more of a trend towards that type of censorship? Or because you said, oh, well, look, if you look at Galileo, it seems like a very similar case. Um, so perhaps we are misinterpreting recent events, and things have always been like that in science, perhaps. I mean,
Yeah.
clearly, with the science wars in biology, for instance, there's been a lot of emphasis on not, say, teaching evolution. That shouldn't have a place in university, trying to censor that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
evolution was certainly a target in some places. Yeah, I don't know. So I if you look at the data, and for example, scholars being targeted by their peers or the
Hmm.
public or their students, it certainly looks like those kinds of cases are increasing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those cases are increasing. It might just be that we're paying attention more now,
Hmm.
or that we are better able to record these
Right.
cases because they're happening online on social media. Um, and if you set up a Google alert for professor fired for X or whatever, like you're going to see these.
Hmm.
Whereas 50 years ago, you didn't have that. So I don't think human psychology has fundamentally changed over the past 50, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. Um, I don't think that is likely to have happened. It is possible that scholars are being censored more often because of the intimidation factor coming from social media and like these petitions that can get started really rapidly and put a lot of
Hmm.
pressure on whoever has power to punish the scholar. So that seems possible to me. But yeah, I'm sure it's been the case for a very long time that scholars were trying to censor each other's work for various reasons. If you look back many years ago, a lot of it would have been surrounding like religious concerns. These days, that's not so much of a thing. At least in like modern Western societies where scientists tend not to be religious in general. It's other things, you know, right now it's progressive values, like research findings that seem to cast doubt on certain like progressive perspectives are targeted for censorship, but for the same kinds of reasons that it could harm people, and it could legitimize like dangerous stereotypes and you know, violations of human rights or something like that. So yeah, like what gets censored has changed. But I think scientists have wanted to censor each other's work probably since whenever people were competing for cultural esteem.
Do you have some good, perhaps, case studies to illustrate this?
The
For listeners who haven't paid
concerns of
attention to these debates about what kind of studies are put under pressure or retracted.
Yeah, so a case study that I often point to, which I've sort of used in later research to look at this harm element, was this paper published a few years ago looking at female mentees of female mentors and finding that these were like PhD students, that female mentees of female mentors tended to have less impactful careers later on than male mentees of male mentors and like other combinations. And people were very worried that that would like undermine women in science and would cause people to, you know, maybe not want to mentor women or maybe not to have a mentor who is a woman. And so it caused this big like moral panic about what these findings are going to do. The paper was retracted by the authors. And it, to me, it seemed to be just like an operationalization like issue. Like people didn't want the authors to call it mentorship. They wanted it to be, rather they were like co-authors at the same institution. It was a sort of, in my view, a sort of minor complaint with the paper that was ultimately deemed legitimate reason to retract the paper. But I have interviewed psychology professors and asked them, you know, are there controversial conclusions or taboo conclusions, like empirical claims that are off limits in your field? And if you were to study those topics or come to certain conclusions, you'd be punished formally or informally. And most people say yes. And the theme of those conclusions is specifically conclusions regarding group differences in typically race or gender or sex, I suppose. And when those differences are attributed to, and here they use a lot of different words, but they're all related to biology, basically. So if you point to a biological or an evolutionary or a natural, or some people would say nativist or essentialist or immutable explanation for those differences, and then specifically if it regards a domain in which men are outperforming women or white people are outperforming Black people. So those kinds of explanations for those kinds of group differences are generally frowned upon. And then like to contrast that to more desirable conclusions, it would be, I think the favorite explanation would be pointing to discrimination or oppression or prejudice. But there's kind of like a continuum of how acceptable different conclusions are. So basically, if you blame it on society, it's more acceptable. If you blame it on like natural differences, it's more off limits. And then in between, you might get things like cultural explanations, which is like unclear where those cultural differences are coming from. But in any case, they're somewhere in between the two. So those today are the kinds of explanations that will tend to get a scholar in trouble.
Right. I mean, in some of your writing and podcasts, you've said if studies show perhaps that women are better in something, that has a much easier time being published than a paper that says the same thing, but for men.
Yeah, I have a couple of studies, and Steve Stewart-Williams has several studies and papers that find that people more favorably react to scientific findings that make women look better than men than findings that make men look better than women. So people kind of have this bias toward wanting to view women as relatively better than men. And also rather maybe they're particularly averse to the opposite conclusion.
Yeah.
They don't want any research to suggest men might be better than women.
And thinking about the harm component.
In a particular way, that is.
Yeah, presumably the motivation is that, look, this could be used to justify perhaps unequal, say, distribution of resources in society, right, which clearly seems like a bad thing if we think, oh, maybe this research is mistaken. And so given how there's some uncertainty involved always in research, perhaps it's I mean, often the word is used, our dangerous research. Yeah, one thing I was thinking about in those cases was this distinction between type 1 and type 2 errors, where people interested in, or more progressive people who think more about harm, what they want to avoid is precisely that, perhaps trying to suggest with research that types of inequality might be justified when they in fact not, versus showing, say, they are more justified than we might have anticipated for whatever reason that might be.
Yeah, I think it is certainly for some scholars, they might even explicitly endorse sort of differential standards for different kinds of findings. So the kinds of findings that seem to have potential to justify like unfairness that we've already deemed like we're no longer doing that. Like men and women are going to be treated equally. They're going to have the same rights, blah, 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 blah. Like anything that threatens that moral goal.
Yeah.
They might say it's legitimate to hold that to a higher standard for precisely what you're saying. Like when we're choosing which areas to make, and science is always this like moving target, you know, maybe it's not worth risking it. And I don't personally share that view, but I think it's like an understandable one. And yeah, I don't know how much of this comes down to like disagreements in philosophy of science and how we should be evaluating papers. I mean, one thing we point to in the paper, in the censorship paper you mentioned, is that a lot of these harm concerns they've never been like empirically validated. So like the paper that found the female mentors, you know, weren't performing as well later in their careers when they had female mentees when they had female mentors. A lot of people said that this is going to be detrimental to women in science, but that paper was published temporarily. It was probably one of the most read papers that came out that whole entire year, because it caused so much drama.
Yeah.
And nothing bad happened, so far as I can tell. Even though I'm sure plenty of people read it and said, oh yeah, that makes sense, it's probably true. I didn't see any evidence of anything bad happening to women in science as a result of that paper. And in fact, the journal said that they would like invest in initiatives to help women in science, although I'm not sure if they ever actually did that.
Right.
But they said they were going to.
It's interesting with that study because you could very easily interpret it as follows, that, well, this shows that, say, the recommendation letters written by women aren't taken as serious, and that's an issue for feminism, right? So the study could actually show that there's a problem that has to be addressed, and I guess you can see it in two ways. One is thinking, well, women scientists are worse mentors, versus, well, perhaps if they try to write recommendation letters, those aren't taken as serious. And maybe because you get also these perhaps a bit network biases where men still tend to prefer networking with other men, at least on average, and women prefer on average to network with other women. But of course, if you look at a very senior level within science, you get much more of a gender ratio bias than on, say,
Mhm.
the junior level,
Mhm.
right? So that could explain some of the data.
Mm.
It's hard to see how that paper itself falls very strongly into one perspective.
Yeah, I agree. So because that paper was retracted and also now everyone knows, don't touch this topic or
Yeah.
I'm gonna get in a lot of trouble. Um, Nobody will ever follow up on it to see
Mm,
why it might be happening. And as
right.
you said, it might be happening because of a reason that progressives would like, which is, well, it's actually discrimination against female mentors
Yeah.
and their letters of recommendation or whatever it is. So yeah, we don't get to know why, and then we don't
Mm,
get to search for potential solutions if there are potential solutions. So this
yeah.
is why when I'm making an error,
Mm,
I would say like, well, let's get the information out there and then let the scientific process happen. If the paper's wrong, we'll discover it's wrong. If it's
mm,
right, we'll better understand why. And then we can use the true information to make the world a better place. Like it doesn't have to be used. And again, I understand why people have these concerns. Like sometimes when I talk about gender differences, for example, in support for scientific censorship, somebody will be like, women shouldn't be allowed to vote. So
mm,
like some people do react that way. So I don't want to say like those concerns are completely illegitimate. However, I personally don't think we're at risk of like a horrible backslide into like taking away women's
yeah.
rights. I think that's unlikely to happen. And I think the people who would do those kinds of things have no
Mm,
power in society and nobody takes them seriously for the most part. Um, so I would be in favor of uh, having a, and I want to say like a low bar for science, but
mm,
when a paper is published, I think if people think it's wrong, then the next step is to conduct more research. Um,
yeah.
and if it is wrong, then show it's wrong.
No, I think that's a good approach. More often anything almost goes. Maybe that's speaking too loosely. But certainly, you think about philosophers of science like Feyerabend, and where, look, having more pluralism in science is probably helpful towards more scientific progress. You don't need to put too much emphasis on any individual study, and I think some of the worries there are a bit from a mistaken view of how science works, that it's much more about individual studies and they show
Mm,
something once and for all when it's
right.
much more about meta-analysis, aggregation of studies. Um, so part of the worry you mentioned, well, there's no evidence often to how harmful a particular claim in a paper might be. It's more based on sort of feelings, impressions. So this might be very bad, and perhaps we take a kind of precautionary approach. We don't know how bad it could be, so perhaps out of precautionary principles, perhaps we might censor that or retract a paper. But as I mentioned, that's probably then based on a wrong view of how science works because individual papers aren't actually that influential unless, say, they get this kind of social media treatment where then suddenly they do become the most read paper from a journal.
Right. Yeah. I think that's actually one thing that scientists could perhaps do a better job
Hmm.
of doing is like educating the public and their students of what science actually is. Like I get quite irritated by my peers who like will tweet or post wherever they're like, trust the
Yeah.
science. And it's like, no, that's not what we're doing. Like
Hmm.
science is never an end. Well, it's not never an end state, but like the science is a temporary position that we're developing over time. And
Hmm.
like some of it's wrong, maybe most of it's wrong. Um, but it's leading somewhere that's truer or more correct
Hmm.
than where we came
Right.
from. And so, yeah, I think like we need to better educate the public that just because the scientific finding says X, it does not mean X is true. Um,
Hmm.
you should update your beliefs a little bit and be like X is more likely to be true.
Hmm.
But it doesn't mean that anything that contradicts X is bullshit. So yeah, I think scientists themselves often lose sight of that just because science does or does not show something in one paper,
Hmm.
that does not mean all that much. I
That's
mean,
right. Yeah, I wrote a paper actually on that in the context of the COVID epidemic, where
Mm.
you got a lot of these debates about trust the science, and you get all the science skepticism. And when you tell people that the way science works is you have one study and it proves something, and then another study comes out and disproves it, then people will lose trust in science because they have this
Mhm.
mistaken view of how science works. And then suddenly it all seems kind of fake. Anything goes. And similarly with retraction, say for politically motivated reasons, it eliminates sort of this aspect of how typically the majority of the public think about science. Oh, it's this value neutral enterprise. Um, the truth should be the only factor there, and then people trust it less if it doesn't adhere to the standard. Um, and that seems worrisome. So, in fact, scientists should be more communicative of the sort, look, this research is tentative. We'll need to do follow-up studies on this. But yeah, there's many factors with this. We talked about how science and nature often glamorizes the
Mhm.
research, and it's like, oh, this is the study for the future. Here we found something groundbreaking. But yeah, it's hard to think about how we could communicate science better there, because that would require more of a collective response by scientists, the public, science
Mhm.
communicators, and the like.
Yeah, and I guess that yeah, that goes back to the issue of both the motivations of the scientists and science journals is they really want to make these broad, conclusive claims, and that's
Hmm.
just not like any one study is going to be using one operationalization or maybe like two or three operationalizations of a particular variable, a particular outcome, looking at a particular sample in a particular time.
Yeah.
Like all these claims about cultural things. I find it interesting in the context of like hiring discrimination against women.
Hmm.
People think that if if employers discriminated against women 30 years ago, then that can be used as evidence that they do today. But that's something that changes
Hmm.
both by cultures and over time. And so when it comes to a type of empirical conclusion that's culture dependent and not just like a stable description of the biological world or something, or at
Yeah.
least a semi-stable one, you have to keep updating those estimates because they're going to change. And people seem to forget that a lot of, especially what's happening in the social behavioral sciences, is descriptions of like a precise moment and a precise group of people, and not
Hmm.
we can make this huge broad claim about the way all people are all the time.
Yeah, and I suppose when you talk about hiring, that's clearly something that is now a controversial issue where typically scientists as well as humanities scholars, perhaps humanities scholars more so, are more left-leaning. So there is
Mhm.
more of an emphasis on having, say, gender balance in the department. And so
Mhm.
because historically hiring has been mostly male, so most departments are have yeah more men in them than women. Maybe psychology is a difference there
Yeah,
because the number
psychology
of
now.
students are so different, right?
Yeah.
Um, did that
Although
there?
I think if you look at the top, I'm not 100% sure,
Hmm,
but I think if you looked at, for example, distinguished professors in
yeah.
psychology or something, they might still have more men than women.
Hmm,
Um, but certainly the tendency has been growing more toward women. And so in like 20 years, I expect it'll be majority
yeah.
women, even at the tippy top tier. Yeah.
And even if you think, oh, that could be a problem eventually, or perhaps even right now, um, the historical bias is still stronger, so it's the more important thing to go against. And
Mm.
because I think maybe there's a sort of attitude of, look, at least in the philosophy of science literature on values in science, often the argument is, look, we should be more explicit about the values in science, because if you talk about science being value neutral, often we make the implicit values sort of invisible, where we might get to something like a status quo bias,
Mm.
when there might be bad values behind that. So maybe hiring in science departments in the 60s, 80s, there probably was a lot of bias towards men back then. And now again, type 1, type 2 error. It's
Mhm.
better to err on the side of hiring a woman instead of a man because of that, because the harm of that is less likely to be impactful than contributing even more to the existing gender inequalities, right? Because if you think about
Yeah.
subjects across, if you try to aggregate, say all the professors across all fields, you probably still get a bias towards men. And then people might think, oh, there's no reason then to go against fields like psychology, nursing, whatever other
So
fields.
that's actually not true anymore, at
Ah,
least in the US. I think professors, university professors are very, very slightly tilted toward women. So it's like something like
hmm.
51% are women and 49% are men, or
Oh,
50.2. It's a small advantage. Well, I don't call it
yeah.
advantage, but I've wondered about that because you'll see people talking about, oh, women have made all these
Hmm.
gains here and there and blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. But if you still look at the tippy top tier, there's still
Hmm.
more men. And it's like, well, that tippy top tier was decided 50 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
And so I don't know if that should be our concern or like the standard that we are reacting to.
Hmm.
So if it were true that 40 years ago there was like really clear evidence that people
Yeah.
were discriminating against women, and I think that they probably were in certain domains anyway. Women who were as qualified or more qualified than men were being passed over for
Hmm.
these males. And look, we can see it, like, why are 70% of these kinds of professors men and
Yeah.
30% women? Whereas if you look among associate professors or assistant professors, there are actually more women than men. But if we continue to react to that top and preferentially hire women, then we're just going to create the exact problem in reverse. And then
Hmm.
50 years from now, we're going to
Right.
be like, well, crap, now 90% of professors are women. Now should we go and discriminate against women in favor of men? Like, to me, it seems if we can see that we have
Hmm.
reversed things in recent years,
Yeah.
and now we're treating people more fairly, maybe we
Hmm.
even have a small preference for women. To me, the fact that the top tiers show evidence of bias 50 years ago is not a good reason to continue
Hmm.
to, and especially because the men who got those advantages 50 years ago are not the men paying the price today. Like, the men today, you know, maybe they're their fathers, but those fathers had daughters too.
Hmm.
So to me, it doesn't necessarily seem like a good practice to punish young men
Yeah. No,
because
it's an
old men
interesting
got benefits.
question of justice, whether unfair advantages to um, men in the past can be outweighed by disadvantaging men today that are young, right? Um, Maybe that works, maybe not. I'm probably more of the opinion that, well, shouldn't be blamed for the crimes committed of your ancestors. It seems a bit similar. Um, but yeah,
Especially when
one,
the ancestors are everyone's ancestors. That's
that's
the
right,
thing.
yeah.
Like, those, yeah, the fathers who got all the benefits had sons and daughters, and they had sons and
Mm,
daughters, and yeah, to me it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
mm.
But
I mean, one more argument that's often used that I find compelling is that if you think about, say, the role models within science or humanities disciplines, um, at least in philosophy, there's often a discussion point that women are less likely to continue studying, even though on the undergrad
mm,
level, they actually are, I think, in most places now, the majority of students, because of a lack of role models. So if you think
mm,
about the famous influential philosophers now that typically are the, say 60-olds, right? Then there you'd
mm,
still have this gender bias. And then maybe you have to correct for that by putting, say, more distinguished professors that are women. But as you said, maybe then in, say, 30 years, we have the opposite problem, right? Although then you could appeal to, well, look at the history of philosophy or any scientific field. Most of the names will still be men, so
mm.
maybe you wouldn't have that effect as much, at least. So if you try to sort of find a balance and perhaps a slight deviation towards preferential hiring it can seem justifiable, right? As I at least find it compelling to at least justify a kind of milder preference. But if you have very strong hiring biases, say, then that probably causes more problems down the line. There's these difficult trade-offs then you'd have to think about.
Yeah, I mean, for men, I'm concerned about legitimate grievances that they are being discriminated
Right.
against. Like right now, it's generally, I think, socially frowned upon for men to complain about unfairness toward them. But I think it's becoming clearer that their concerns are legitimate. And
Yeah.
so at what point do we have to say, okay, like, I guess we do have to take you seriously because you're pointing out something real happening in society. When it comes to the role models, I don't know. Like, I think if the role models are there and they're interesting role models to highlight of like diverse people and genders and races, etc., then I don't really see harm in that. I do wonder when we start like like you want to look at the top 10 most influential philosophy professors or philosophers, say, of the past 100 years or something. How many of those 10 are actually going to be women? My guess is maybe none. Philosophy is a very slanted field. And so when you kind of take 5 of the actually most famous philosophers who are men and then put in 5 women who didn't contribute much, is that a good role model for women? Like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not familiar with the research on how much the role model. I know people make that argument. I don't know how true it is that they need role models who look like them. And I wonder, like, is there another approach where we say, why, like, can't we have role models that don't look like us? Like, have your role models be the people who are doing the things that you care about and that have interesting things to say, and that have shaped you and the way you think about the world. I don't know. But yeah, if it actually is helpful, then I think that seems to be a not particularly coercive way of potentially helping people who are underrepresented out. And I wouldn't be opposed to that
I guess
if,
the argument is as well much stronger if you think perhaps about instead of gender along the lines of race, where a lot of departments might not have a single black professor, say, and then that argument is much stronger than then, oh, where's the role model there? Yeah. No, it is complex issues, definitely. And I guess part of the worry is that you can't even talk about them as much because they are sort of the discussion itself is sort of loaded, right?
yeah. Well, many people have very strong feelings about these issues. And so, yeah, people are talking publicly about explosive topics is not fun for a lot of people. So,
Yeah, I mean, most people don't want to be controversial, right? It's not psychologically nice to to get hate emails and the like. So yeah.
yeah, this Twitter only makes me have more negative affect in my life. I'm having a good day, and then I go on Twitter and I'm like, no,
Oh no.
why did I do it?
Would you
People
say
are
about
so mean to
yourself
each other.
that you're interested in exploring the more controversial questions?
It's a good question. I actually think I'm not like drawn to controversy, and I find it really irritating when people take intellectual disagreements and turn them into personal conflicts where they call each other names and they hate each
Yeah.
other and they try to undermine one another in their personal and professional lives. I really, really, really hate that. But I do find it really interesting that smart, skilled, expert people can have strong disagreements on empirical questions. and that they cannot resolve them. I find that
Mm.
really interesting. And then I also find it interesting when it seems to me there is like an emerging empirical consensus when it comes to what the data show and what professors will say out loud. So one thing I see in my surveys of psychology professors is that there are a lot of empirical conclusions that like fall into the sort of controversial category where a lot of professors think those conclusions are true, but they won't say so publicly. And so that
Mm.
distorts perceived scientific consensus in one of two ways. Either it creates the impression that there's a scientific consensus when there isn't one, or it creates the impression that there's not a scientific consensus when there is one.
Mm.
And it's always toward the sort of like, you know, the socially desirable conclusions are the ones that people who hold those beliefs, they'll say them out loud. And when you have a belief that contradicts the socially desirable empirical conclusion, professors self-censor on those. And so I
Mm.
find it interesting that our perceptions of what our peers think are probably skewed toward social desirability and away from controversy. And so I'm interested in knowing, like, what do people actually think is true?
Yeah.
And so just by the nature of the fact that people self-censor controversial conclusions, then I'm interested in them. But
Mm.
I personally don't like controversy. Like it uh it like stresses me out when people are really nasty to each other, which
Mm.
happens in those heated spaces. So
Yeah, there doesn't seem much thought about that typically on social media about how that's gonna make any of the researchers feel or the pile-on that can happen
yeah.
on social media often. Like a
Yeah,
kind of echo chamber.
there's this one question in the survey that was really interesting to me. I asked psychology professors how much contempt versus admiration and respect they have toward professors who try to get papers retracted for three different reasons. One was for data fraud,
Hmm.
and professors, for the most part, really respect those folks, which I think is interesting because it corresponds to the data colada guys who go after actual data fraud and have gotten papers retracted because the data were made up. And then if you look at scholars who start these social media campaigns or petitions to retract papers for errors, opinion is much more mixed. Some people respect these
Hmm.
people, some people really hate them, but on average, people are kind of on the fence. And then for social media campaigns or petitions to retract papers based on the potential moral consequences of those findings being disseminated,
Hmm.
the modal response is maximum contempt. So professors really hate people who go on Twitter and try to get papers retracted for moral reasons. And
Hmm.
I find that really interesting because I would not know it from being on Twitter. I
Yeah.
would think that people love that. That people are like retweeting and signing petitions. But I think a lot of it is people are scared of getting targeted themselves. So they feel
Hmm.
pressure to conform with what they perceive as the consensus. Everybody thinks this paper is immoral and it's sexist and it's going to
Yeah.
cause all this harm. But they're only agreeing with that position because they don't want a target on their own back, at least some of the time. And so I think this really distorts the perception of scientific culture and perceptions about what is true and perceptions about what is acceptable scientific conduct. And I would like to be a person who helps sort of like liberate the scientists to
Hmm.
say what they think, because I think it's really important that of all the people, who should be uh, speaking candidly about issues and science, it's
Hmm.
scientists themselves. And like, it would be really useful to know what is the scientific consensus on these controversial issues, and what is the scientific consensus regarding whether we should be calling each other names in publications.
Yeah. It is
Like I
really
think
interesting. No, I agree with you there. Like if we were to do, say, a cost-benefit analysis of a more truth-focused science, say, versus a more trying to prevent harm, um, typically we'd think, well, the way the process of science is meant to work is that even if someone publishes something very controversial that we think is deeply morally wrong, but presumably we also think it's just empirically wrong, that then the
Mm,
science will show it to be wrong eventually, that
mhm,
other people will do further studies to show, no, these people are mistaken. And that's probably a better way of convincing people that something is wrong. So I see this sometimes, say, with the studies on, say, racial differences. It seems to me that people who are genuine racists, who think whites are the superior race, and any non-whites are less intelligent and the like, they'll think that the fact that papers get retracted for the more political reasons, they think that proves them to be
mhm.
right, right? That gives them a kind of vindication because they aren't debunked in the scientific sphere as much, and
Mm.
I think that's worrisome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. So yeah, so could it be that by retracting a paper via like social outrage,
Hmm.
does that, at least to some groups, give that paper more legitimacy than what would have happened if scientists would have come along and been like, no, let me tell you why that paper is
Yeah.
so flawed and those conclusions were unwarranted.
Hmm.
That seems like a very plausible hypothesis to me, and now I kind of want to test it.
Yeah, how would you design an experiment for that? I guess
I think you
asking.
would just like have people read a scientific paper
Yeah.
that's maybe flawed. Most scientific papers are, but
Hmm.
whatever, it can have a particular flaw. And then be like, people got pissed and started this petition, and then the journal
Hmm.
retracted it. Versus a year later, scholars came along and pointed out this
Right.
flaw. uh,
So nice
yeah,
vignettes there, and then you ask them what is their attitude towards the original paper. Do they not trust the research as much, or yeah,
yeah,
it's
I think
interesting.
that's a good study.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe something we can do.
Yeah, or one of your listeners. If you guys have time,
That's right. There's only so many
it's
questions
an
you can
idea for
try
your
to answer.
dissertation.
Hmm. No, it seems like an easy study even to do, right?
Yeah, it would be. I mean, you probably would want to you'd want to try it with like 5 or 6 different topics to show that it generalizes across different kinds of findings. But I think in both cases, you could have um, the public outrage could be both about the flaws of the paper. They could say, "Oh, it has this flaw, and also it's going to cause this horrible
Hmm.
social outcome." And you could also do it in a way that it appeals to the harm concerns of liberals or conservatives,
Hmm.
and then actually even potentially show that you're going to create this sort of like potentially conspiracy belief among the the group who doesn't share those harm concerns when the paper is retracted, as opposed to in
Hmm.
time it is scientifically debunked. Um, yeah, that's an interesting idea, and
Yeah, no. Trust before doing this experiment in science and then afterwards, whether that changes it would be very
mm.
interesting.
That's actually another thing is like people often worry that, science, even if they generally think, okay, scientists themselves for the most part aren't these terrible people who have terrible motives, they might be giving legitimacy to actual horrible people in the world.
Hmm.
And I also would like to know, how often do like horrible people out in the world who want to do horrible things, like, do they really need science to do what it is they
Right.
want to
Yeah.
do? And like, sure, they might use science to try to like support their arguments, but would they still have their beliefs with or without the science? And would they still pursue their same goals with or without the science?
Hmm.
I would suspect a lot of the time the answer is yes, they would. And the scientist is used, but it's not a cause of whatever it is they're trying to accomplish.
No, I think that perhaps nicely encapsulate that we should move science more towards focus on truth. I'm maybe too much inspired there by Feyerabend, that if we just let 1,000 flowers bloom, it's easier to find the truth, because then these ideas can more compete against each other, rather than trying to filter out things via perhaps more non-scientific criteria. But at least, well, I mean, values often do play roles in science. Say animal testing. There clearly we have uh, these ethics boards meeting about, prior to the experiment taking place, whether this research is justified, do the costs, say, to animals outweigh the potential benefits. And I'm not too sure about the psychological research there, but typically I think most research also involves a kind of review of the experiments, right? So presumably, even if a study is, say, retracted, whether by the authors or the journal, prior to that, people have looked at the experimental setup and said, look, this seems ethically fine, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to distinguish. So when I talk about moral concerns with the science, I'm talking about like concerns about the morality of the information that would be generated by the science, whereas you're talking about the ethics of conducting the study itself. So like in the social behavioral sciences, if we're conducting a survey asking people questions, we have to get ethics approval. But what we're actually asking people is almost never approaching like what you're talking about, like animal research, where we're literally causing what we believe to be suffering of non-human animals. In the context of like most of psychology research, for example, we're asking people questions, and like the worst thing we ever do is ask people a question that makes them a little bit uncomfortable. You know, we're not causing suffering. But the moral concerns about, well, if this information gets out in the world, then what will happen? But the hard thing with that is it's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen when a piece of information gets out into the world, or gets out into the world and then is retracted, or doesn't get out into the world, but it's actually true. I don't think anybody has a really good way of estimating the consequences of a scientific conclusion, yet scientists act as though they do know. They act as though if people came to believe this horrible thing would happen. And I just don't know that we have good reason to expect any particular outcome to result from a piece of information making its way out into the world.
So when
And then
studies go through ethics review in psychology that might be controversial in their setup because they are on a controversial question, do you think the ethics review ever considers the potential implications then the information itself could have?
So you do have to do, when you do an ethics application there, when you're talking about the harm to participants, you do have to justify why the scientific output is more valuable than the harm to participants. So you have to say, like, participants might be slightly uncomfortable because I'm asking them about their sexual orientation, and some people feel uncomfortable disclosing that, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But then you have to say, but we will learn about sexual orientation and how it can manifest in different ways, or whatever the point of the research is. So you have to say, like, what we will learn is more valuable than the harm we will inflict. But for a lot of this research, the harm inflicted is virtually none. Like, it's asking people questions. And
so
of course, there are questions that can be distressing, but they're not, we're not like locking people up or giving them diseases, or, you know, doing anything really bad.
So controversial research would typically also always be approved, say.
I don't want to say that. I've actually heard people claiming that their ethics boards are becoming increasingly heavy-handed in that it used to be, if you don't harm your participants, then you can ask questions.
Yeah.
But now I hear people claiming that the ethics boards in the US, they're called IRBs, institutional review boards, that they're starting to reject research based on the question itself more. I haven't personally seen that, but it wouldn't surprise me too much if that were happening. Like if people hypothesize, so for example, there was this study decades ago, I think, I forget what year, but it's an old study that submitted ethics applications for a study that was looking at discrimination against, there were a couple of them, but I'm trying to remember the details of one specific one. But anyway, it was trying to look at essentially discrimination or reverse discrimination. So it was like discrimination perhaps against like racial and ethnic minorities versus discrimination against white men. And the ethics boards were likelier to reject the proposals that were hypothesizing reverse discrimination than discrimination. But they didn't appeal to the potential like offensiveness of the results. They said, the sample size is too small. So they sort of like appealed to scientific principles to reject a proposal. So it's that kind of thing might happen. But yeah, I think the concerns that we're seeing a lot of now and what, for example, Nature Springer is adding to their editorial guidelines, which is like, we will reject or retract research that has potential to undermine the dignity of social groups. So they're concerned about people publishing findings that, if they were to become accepted as true information, could have bad consequences out in the world. And that's a very different thing than don't torture animals to try to prove that your point, right? Or at least I think that those are rather different things, insofar as we can be sure that if you're torturing your participants, that the torture is going to happen. But we cannot be sure that telling the world X is true is going to do good or bad.
Right. So in psychological research, typically it's very hard to predict whether there will be any harms to larger groups, right? And then I guess the question is less about scientists asserting, oh yes, it will have this negative impact, and rather, well, okay, it could perhaps, but then we don't know the probability. So how should we make decisions here? Because in a way, any type of research could have some probability of a very negative impact, right? So that's a very difficult question to answer then, at which point you wanna start to intervene. And yeah, I saw the discussion on Twitter as well about the new guidelines by Nature, and it seems very hard to define what it would mean for research to do undermine human dignity.
Yeah, and that's an empirical, that human dignity rests on an empirical reality in the world, and it's not a moral goal that we have as humans. Like, no, in order for humans to have dignity, X must be true.
Right.
It's like, why can't we say humans have dignity regardless of whether X is true? Like, that's where it gets tricky to me, is people assert these sort of moral claims as though they are objective empirical claims, and I don't think they are. So like in the context of the female mentors paper, like, we don't know what harm would have happened to women if that paper stayed published. And we don't know what harm happened as a result of it being retracted. Like, who's to say? Like, I certainly don't know. I wouldn't claim to know. But given that we don't know whether a paper is going to be harmful, whether a piece of information is going to be harmful or not, nor the harms of withholding that piece of information, it seems to me then we should let science do science. And if we come to a point where we realize, hey, this really is having harms, then we figure out what to do. Maybe that's naive. I don't know. But
it seems to me that even if there's wide consensus that research could have a negative impact, it seems that the very act of retraction is gonna widely more publicize the paper, make it way more influential than it would otherwise have been. So it seems that even if you agree that a paper could have a negative impact, it seems retraction is still the worst thing you can do.
Probably a lot of the time, yeah, just the effort to retract a paper, it probably often gives the paper more legitimacy than it would
Yeah.
have gotten if people just ignored it.
Hmm.
Um, but that's also an empirical question, and like that would be a very cool one to test too. Like, how does a paper go from published, stirs up a controversy? Okay, now there's a petition and
Mm.
4,000 people signed it. And like, how does that over time affect whether people believe the claim is true? And then what happens as a result of that claim being accepted or rejected?
Right.
That would be a much harder question to ask because, like, who knows what any scientific finding causes in the long term.
Mm. I mean, you see papers being routinely continue to be cited, even if they've been
Mm.
retracted at some point.
Mhm.
So it seems it wouldn't even take them out of the
Yeah, and the
sphere
same
of
for
science, really, right?
papers that failed to replicate continue to get cited too. So, um, yeah.
Hmm. So what would your ideal, say, philosophy of science look like? How should scientists think about science? Seems you have a much more liberal approach, or people should just try to investigate questions they're interested in.
I do have a more liberal approach. I think that most scientists who are trained to do science in their respective discipline are usually qualified to conduct a study, report the results, write it up, and share it on the internet. Maybe it gets published in a journal, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's a preprint.
Hmm.
Um, and I think all of that is fine. I think like scientists have been publishing incorrect things since the dawn of science, and they're going to continue to do
Hmm.
so. And I think that's just the part of the scientific process. And I think we could do a better job educating the public. Like, just because a scientist said X does not mean X is true. In fact, 99% of scientists could say it's false and one says it's true. Um, uh, so educating the public better there, but allowing scholars to share and disseminate information, I think would be there's a new platform called, I don't remember pronounce it right or wrong, Queos or something. It's
Hmm.
Queios. And they're trying a new model, which is you can post your paper up there as a preprint. I think it only has to get 2 out of 5 stars to stay up. So if it gets 1, that's like 1 star. Okay, that means like a lot of scientists think this is utter garbage.
Right.
Then it's considered retracted. But that's a low bar. It has to have 2
Hmm.
stars. And if it has 2 stars, it can be published there. The nice thing about that is it doesn't create the illusion that so many journals currently create, which is if this is published in our papers, it's true.
Right. Yeah.
They're saying it's published in our papers, but it has 3 out of 5 stars, or it has 2.5 out of 5 stars.
Hmm.
So take this with a grain of salt. And then all the reviews are made public too. And I don't know that that's a perfect model. I do think it's an interesting model, and I think it's potentially better than what we
Hmm.
currently have, where scholars try to obstruct one another's papers in the peer review process. One person can be grumpy and like get a paper rejected after months of revisions. I have had some papers they go through the peer review process for years, even at the
Hmm.
same journal for years, because they just do R and R, R and R, R and R, R and R,
Right.
revise and resubmit, revise and resubmit. So yeah, I'm more concerned about good information getting suppressed than bad information getting out there,
Hmm.
because bad information is out there and it's going to be out there and it's always been out there. And we just need a better way of flagging what's promising and what's not promising,
Hmm.
rather than trying to obstruct potentially promising things.
Yeah.
But I understand a lot of people are, a lot of people are really worried about misinformation and disinformation and the
Hmm.
potential dangers of that. And I get it. But to me, that's more of a concern with like everyday people than scientists. With
Hmm.
scientists, I think we should trust that they have some expertise and they're going to screw up more often than not. And we can talk about how they screwed up when they do by writing reviews and explaining how they're mistaken. But I think right now the gatekeeping is a bit too much. There's just like
Yeah.
too much preventing information and delaying information.
Hmm.
from getting out into the
I
world.
guess preprint servers, at least to some
Yeah.
extent, alleviate that because, I mean, at least in my field, it's becoming philosophy of science. If published together with biologists, say we've put papers up on preprint servers, they've been under review for over a year. At least people can see it, right? So that's better. It's good that journals typically don't prohibit that anymore, that putting those up there. I have
Although some
probably
prohibit you from citing them, which I think is stupid. Like,
interesting, yeah. No, that seems like a weird rule.
yeah.
Hmm.
I think it might be the journals, like they're trying to get their own impact factors higher, or wait, what is it
I
called? Yeah,
see, I
impact factor.
see.
Because like you can only cite papers that have been published in our kind of journal.
Yeah, I guess there are perverse incentive for the journals themselves to get better in the rankings, and yeah, where maybe we need to think about better mechanisms to prevent that. But I think it's a great idea that you mentioned. Maybe let's just have more alternative forms of publishing, and there's probably not a need for this more meta level discussion of, oh, is peer review bad or not? Well, just have these different forms of publishing, and they can probably well coexist next to each other. I'm not of the opinion that we need to think about one necessarily replacing another. Yeah, but one thing perhaps I wanted to mention before we end is in thinking about academic freedom, and most people think it's very important, but I think a lot of people are sort of afraid of speaking out for academic freedom now because the mere act of doing so, or saying, look, there should be, yes, controversial research should be out there, it makes you affiliated with the findings in the research, that it means you agree with it. Which shouldn't be the case at all if you think about, say, John Stuart Mill. You want the opinions heard of people even you most deeply disagree with, right? But I now see this quite commonly, that people who would come out, say, to defend papers being published on that are very controversial, people think that person must agree with the findings. Yeah.
I don't know how much of that is like a rhetorical maneuver versus like, because another thing you'll see is if an academic journal publishes a paper, people will go after the editors of the journal as though they hold the views of the paper. And
That's
it's
the
like
same, yeah.
journals, their job is to post like interesting and potentially true information, even if none of them think it's actually true. Like they're supposed to be publishing like high quality and interesting science, not things that 100% cohere with my own personal worldview. And so like I don't know, when people go after people for being affiliated with a particular institution that's published certain things, or as you're saying, like defending the rights of a scholar to pursue research, even if I completely disagree with their research conclusions. Like if people are just making a mistake and they think that defending someone's right to speech or to academic freedom means I agree with everything that they're studying or saying, then you could just correct them. But I'm not sure that it's a sincere mistake. I think it might just be something people do to intimidate other people. So if I really hate a scholar and what they're doing and what they're publishing, and I not only go after them, but I go after everyone defending them, now I've intimidated people away from like defending other people I disagree with. So it's a good tactic. I don't think it's really a legitimate tactic. I think there's a lot of like guilt by association stuff that's unfair, or rather it's not useful for science. But people do use those strategies and they're effective. And a lot of people are, yeah, they're afraid to defend academic freedom in general because that means they have to defend a lot of people that they consider to have like unsavory views.
Yeah.
But I'm a proponent of principles. Like this is why I really like FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, because they stick to their principles and they will defend wildly contradictory perspectives, so long as they fall within people's rights for free speech. So,
Yeah, I wonder if you've seen Peter Singer's Journal for Controversial Ideas,
mhm.
where it often happened that he himself has been attributed the beliefs of everything published in a paper. So as you say, the editors
Yeah.
are, these journals are seen as, oh, well, if it's published in there, the editor must agree with everything.
Yeah, which is
Hmm.
not what it's not what I want journals doing. Like
Yeah.
that would be super boring. It would be like whoever the editor in chief is, here are a bunch of papers that I think are right. And anyone who disagrees with me, screw you, you can't publish here. Like that's not what a good editor should be doing, I don't
Hmm.
think. But again, yeah, do people really think Peter Singer holds all those views, or do they just say it because they don't like him and they don't like the journal?
Hmm. Right. Oh, thanks so much for this interesting discussion. I think it's a great
Okay.
episode.
Thanks for having me. I don't know if I expected it to go where it went, but it was entertaining.
No, I think
I feel like I was ranting a little bit, so I'm sorry.
I think those make for the best episodes, perhaps.
Fingers crossed.
Hmm. If you have something like an axe to grind, I think most listeners like to hear people speak from the heart, probably. So yeah,
I probably did
I,
that.
that's good. Yeah. So thanks for coming on, all the listeners. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you again.